98 men, 1 submarine, 3 miles of water. In March of 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine left her base on the Kamchatka Peninsula and went out on an ordinary patrol. She did not come back, and she did not send anything that explained why. The Soviet Navy searched with everything it had for weeks and found nothing at all. The United States found her in 5 months, photographed her, and then spent 6 years and an entire invented industry building a ship that could reach 3 miles down and pick her up off the floor of the ocean. That much is now official. The government wrote its own history of the operation and released it. This is the page where that history explains what they actually recovered. Everything that matters on it has been withheld. Her name was K-129, diesel-electric, commissioned in 1962, carrying ballistic missiles. NATO called her class Golf II. She sailed from Rybachi on Kamchatka with the Pacific Fleet's 15th Submarine Squadron. 98 men aboard. Patrol like that runs on signals. A submarine hiding does not chat. But at fixed points, she is required to report, and the report is not optional. The midpoint report was due by midnight on the 8th of March, 1968. It did not come. Moscow waited, called, waited again, then sent out a search that was, by any measure, enormous. Surface ships, aircraft, submarines, sweeping an ocean for weeks. They found nothing. Not a hull, not an oil slick anyone could confirm, not a body. Eventually, the Soviet Navy stopped looking, and the men aboard were carried on the books as missing. Their families were told very little, and what they were told was not true. And there is one more thing about that patrol which has never been explained by anybody on either side. When the wreck was finally located, it was not on her assigned route. It was a long way from it. Here is the first place where this story stops agreeing with itself. The Soviet Navy dates the loss from the missed signal, the 8th of March. That is the date on the memorials, and that is the date the families keep. The American record says something different. Across the Pacific, the United States was listening. Arrays of underwater microphones, some strung on the sea floor for submarines, some there to catch nuclear tests. A very large amount of ocean recorded continuously by people who were not looking for K-129 at all. Nobody sat down in March 1968 and listened for a Soviet submarine dying. It was only afterwards, once the Americans understood something had gone missing, that anyone went back through the tapes looking for it. And in those recordings, there is an event. Not one sound, 2 extended destructive events, one after the other. Loud, structural, and unmistakably not natural. The same event reached different stations at slightly different moments, and that difference can be worked backwards into a position. It put the source within 2 nautical miles of a point in the open Pacific near the international date line, and it put the time at the 11th of March, 3 days after she stopped answering. Nobody has ever reconciled those 2 records. Either she was silent for 3 days and then died, which is difficult to explain for a submarine that was required to report and had not. Or she died on the 8th and the ocean recorded something else entirely. Russian officials have long suspected the 11th. The memorials still say the 8th. We are going to leave that where it is, because that is where the evidence leaves it. But hold on to it, because that recording, whatever it was of, is the only reason anybody ever found her. In the middle of July 1968, an American submarine called Halibut went to sea on an operation named Velvet Fist. Halibut was an odd ship. She had been built to launch missiles and then converted into something else, a boat that carried cameras and towed them deep on cable. She was given the position the acoustics had produced and told to search it. A fix accurate to 2 miles sounds precise. On the floor of the Pacific, it is not. Not when you are looking at it 3 miles below you through a camera in absolute darkness, a few frames at a time. It took her 3 weeks. On the 20th of August, 1968, the cameras came back with a submarine on them. Then Halibut stayed and photographed her. Not a few confirming frames, more than 20,000 photographs over weeks. They showed a hull lying in 2 major pieces close together, about 3 miles down. Consider what that means at this point in the story, because it is the strangest fact in it, and it goes past very quickly. The Soviet Navy had searched for its own submarine with an entire fleet and failed. The United States, working from a sound, had found her, sat over her, and photographed her 20,000 times, and said nothing. For 6 years, they had photographs, 20,000 of them, and photographs were not what anybody wanted. Inside that hull were 3 things: ballistic missiles with their warheads, not the outside of a missile, which the Americans had already seen from a distance, the inside of one, code books, paper, and cipher machines, the devices that turned Soviet naval orders into noise. You cannot read a code book from a photograph taken through 3 miles of water. To get any of it, somebody had to go and physically take it. In July of 1969, the Central Intelligence Agency set up a unit to do exactly that. It was called the Special Projects Staff. The security compartment the work lived in was called Jennifer, and the decision they made is the reason we are still talking about this. They did not decide to salvage her, to go down, cut her open, and bring pieces up. They decided to lift her whole off the floor of the ocean 3 miles up in one piece and into the belly of a ship. Nothing of that size had ever been lifted from that depth. There was no ship that could do it. There was no machine that could grip it. There was no pipe that could hang that far down and still hold. All 3 would have to be invented, built, and paid for, and none of it could be explained to anyone. A ship that can lift a submarine off the floor of the Pacific cannot be built quietly. It is enormous. It is built in a shipyard by thousands of people in daylight next to a public road. So the agency did not try to hide it. They explained it. The explanation was Howard Hughes, aviator, industrialist, and by the 1970s, a man so private and so wealthy that almost anything could be attributed to him and almost nobody could check. A plausible reason for a strange ship. The story was this: scattered across the deep ocean floor, there are lumps of metal ore, roughly the size of a potato. Manganese, nickel, cobalt, copper. They are real, and they are down there right now. And in 1972, the world was told that Howard Hughes intended to go and get them at a depth nobody had ever mined, with a ship built specially for the purpose. It was not a rumor, and it was not a whisper. It was announced. Now, a cover story is usually thought of as something that stops people asking. This one was the opposite. It invited the questions, and it had answers. Why is the ship that size? Because nodules are 3 miles down. Why the enormous derrick? Because you need 3 miles of pipe. Why the hole in the hull? Because that is how the pipe comes through in weather. Every answer was consistent with every other answer. That is why it lasted, and this is the part that separates this operation from every other cover story of the Cold War. It worked too well. The financial press covered deep-sea mining as an emerging industry. Analysts assessed it, and other companies, real companies spending real money, began moving into seabed mining because a serious operator with serious capital had evidently decided it was viable. An industry started forming around a business that did not exist. Nobody involved in those decisions knew that the flagship of their new sector was a machine for stealing a submarine. And neither did most of the people building it. Thousands of workers and engineers did honest work on that ship for years, believing they were building the future of ocean mining. They were not lied to once. They were lied to every day at scale by an organization that was extremely good at it. Whatever else this operation was, it was that too, and the cover held for 2 years, through construction, through sea trials, through the operation itself. It did not fail because a foreign intelligence service broke it. It failed for a reason nobody had planned for, and we will get to that. Ship was built at Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock on the Delaware River, south of Philadelphia. In public, by people who thought they were building a mining vessel, because that is what they had been told. She was christened in 1972, 619 feet long, with a derrick amidships tall enough to be seen from a long way off. And she had one feature that a mining ship could plausibly have, and that this ship absolutely had to have: a hole in the bottom. It is called a moon pool, a chamber running down through the middle of the hull, open to the sea below, sealed off by gates. Close the gates, pump it dry, and you have a covered dock in the middle of the ocean with the ocean underneath it. That is where a submarine was supposed to end up. Then the pipe. To reach the sea floor, you lower a string of steel pipe section by section, 3 miles of it, and every section you add carries the weight of everything already hanging below it. Plus, at the end, a submarine. It is not a cable. It is a column under enormous tension in moving water. And none of it could be tested at full scale. There was no second ship to practice on, and no way to rehearse hanging 3 miles of pipe except by hanging 3 miles of pipe. All of it was designed, built, and paid for as mining equipment, and what it cost has never been officially stated. It ran over budget badly enough to nearly end the program, but the figure itself has never been released, and we will come back to why. The ship was the easy half. Something still had to reach down and take hold of a submarine. What they built was a claw, steel arms on a frame big enough to close around a hull section, strong enough to carry it, and delicate enough not to crush what it was carrying. The crew called it Clementine. And here the problem changes shape. A mining ship can be explained. A giant mechanical claw sitting in a yard in the open, photographed by anybody driving past, cannot. So Clementine was never built outdoors. She was assembled at Redwood City in California inside a barge. Not alongside it. Inside it, the barge was 324 feet long, 106 feet wide, and over 90 feet high, with a roof that retracted. The claw was built under that roof, and the roof stayed shut. Then, in the spring of 1974, the two halves of this machine met. The barge was towed out to Catalina Island off Southern California. There, it submerged. Underwater, it opened its roof. Above it, the ship opened the gates in the bottom of her moon pool, and the claw was lifted up out of one and into the other, entirely beneath the surface. Then the barge closed, surfaced, and went home. An object the size of a building was designed, assembled, moved across open water, and installed in a ship, and never once existed in open air where anybody could see it. By the summer of 1974, everything was ready. On the 4th of July, 1974, the ship arrived over the wreck. 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii, no land in any direction. And they had company. Soviet vessels came to look, circled, watched, photographed a mining crew stacking pipe, and did not understand that they were looking at an American ship sitting directly on top of their own missing submarine. Then they left. The lift began on the 1st of August, 1974. It starts as manual labor. A section of pipe is lifted vertical, threaded onto the string, tightened, and the whole column is lowered by its own length. Then the next one. Then the next. 3 miles of pipe, one section at a time, around the clock. It takes days before the claw is anywhere near the bottom. And all that time, the ship has to not move, cannot anchor in 3 miles of water. She is held by thrusters working continuously against wind, current, and swell over a fixed point on a sea floor nobody can see, because if she wanders, the column hanging beneath her stops being vertical. Then the hard part, Clementine has to be set down onto a hull that has been lying in the dark since 1968, closed and locked. There is no camera feed. There is no way to reach down and adjust anything. Everything is inferred from tension and instruments. Men in a control room reading numbers and deciding on the strength of those numbers that the claw is holding what they think it is holding. And it worked. They took hold of her, and they lifted. The submarine came up off the sea floor, and then, partway through the ascent, the claw failed. Several of the arms gave way. What they were holding broke apart. Most of the submarine, the great majority of what they had just successfully lifted, fell back 3 miles onto the sea floor in pieces. 6 years of work, an invented industry, a purpose-built ship, and a machine that had never existed before, all of which did exactly what they were designed to do. And the failure came in the one component that had to hold on the way up. And there is nothing anybody on that ship could do about it. Not slow it, not catch it. They were 3 miles away from it, connected by a steel column, and the only information they had was that the load had changed. What was left in the claw was secured in the hold on the 8th of August. The ship turned for home carrying a fraction of what she had come for. So what did they get? The forward section of the submarine, including the torpedo compartment. And that is a real result, a piece of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine recovered from 3 miles down on the deck of an American ship. Nobody had done it before, and nobody has done it since. but measure it against why they went. The ballistic missiles, not recovered. The code books, not recovered. The cipher machines, not recovered. Every one of the 3 objects that the entire operation was built to obtain was in the part of the submarine that fell back into the ocean. There was material in what they raised. In 1993, a panel of Russian experts concluded from plutonium radiation levels that at least 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes had been among it. That is not nothing. A nuclear torpedo is worth studying, but it is not a cipher machine, and it is not a code book, and it is not a missile. Here I have to be careful with you, because almost every account of this story, including the good ones, will now tell you exactly how much came up in feet. One number repeated everywhere. We will come back to where it is actually from. It is not from where you would assume, because there was something else in the wreckage they raised, something the engineering does not cover and the operation had not really planned for. There were men in it. The submarine had been on the sea floor since 1968. 6 of her crew came up with the section that was recovered. The wreckage was radioactive. That is not a detail. It governed everything that happened next. The remains could not be handled the way remains are normally handled, and they could not be taken home to anybody. So, the crew of an American intelligence ship in the middle of the Pacific held a funeral. On the 4th of September, 1974, about 90 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii, the 6 men were buried at sea in a steel chamber. Full military honors. Prayers were read for them, and the Soviet national anthem was played by an American crew for Soviet sailors in the middle of the Cold War, over a grave that neither government would acknowledge for another 18 years. The ceremony was filmed. In October of 1992, the director of Central Intelligence, Robert Gates, went to Moscow. He carried 2 things for President Yeltsin: the Soviet naval flag that had covered the coffins, and the film of the burial. It would be neater to leave it there, and it would not be true. The gesture was not purely a gesture. The United States wanted Russian cooperation on Americans still missing from Vietnam, and a flag and a tape were part of how you open that conversation. Both things are true at once. It was an act of decency, and it was an approach. The families were shown the film years later. Until then, they had been told their sons and husbands were missing. Not where, not how, not that they had been found, raised, and buried with honors by the other side. The operation was over. The cover had held. The agency was already planning a second mission to go back for the part that had fallen. And the secret was already dying. It had started dying 2 months before the lift, and nobody involved knew. On the 5th of June, 1974, burglars broke into the offices of the Summa Corporation in Los Angeles. Hughes Company. They took, among other things, more than 400 pages of documents relating to the contract with the Central Intelligence Agency. Not agents, not a foreign service. Burglars in an office in California, the greatest cover story of the Cold War, and the thread that pulled it apart came out of a filing cabinet. Though I have to flag something because this film has been careful so far, and I am not going to stop at the good bit. That chain, burglary, documents, journalist, story, is the press reconstruction. The agency's own internal history does not mention the burglary at all. It traces the exposure through the press and starts there. So the two records disagree about how the secret broke, exactly as they disagreed about the day the submarine died. I am not going to resolve that for you either. I am going to keep telling you when it happens. If that is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing is how you get it. That is the only time I will ask. Because 8 months later, it reached print. On the 7th of February 1975, the Los Angeles Times put the pieces next to each other. A burglary at a Hughes Company, a contract with the Central Intelligence Agency, a ship, a recovery operation at sea. It was not complete and parts of it were wrong. It was close enough. What happened next is the part that has aged strangely. The director of Central Intelligence, William Colby, went to the editors, personally, and asked them to hold the story. Not a court order, not an injunction. He explained why it mattered, and he asked. And for weeks they held it. Newsrooms that were, in that same period, publishing things the government very much did not want, published, agreed to sit on this one, because they were persuaded there was an operation still running with lives attached to it. It could not hold forever. On the 18th of March, 1975, the columnist Jack Anderson broadcast it. His position was that the operation was over and the secret was now being kept from the public rather than from the Soviets. The next day, the 19th of March, Seymour Hersh published in the New York Times. After that, everyone published. The second mission was canceled. The rest of K-129 is still on the floor of the Pacific. It has been there since 1968. It is there tonight. One more thing happened to this ship, and it is the strangest ending it could have had. She was laid up in the mothball fleet at Suisun Bay for nearly 20 years. Then, in 1996, she was towed out. The structure around the moon pool was cut away, and she was converted, properly, commercially, into a deep water drilling ship. The cover story had been that this vessel existed to work industrially in deep water. A lie invented to explain a machine for stealing a submarine. For the next 18 years, she did exactly that job. For real. Gulf of Mexico, Nigeria, the Black Sea, Angola, Indonesia, India. The lie outlived the operation, and then it became true. She was sold for scrap and reached the breakers at Jushin in China on the 5th of June, 2015, which is a coincidence and only a coincidence, but it is a good one. The 5th of June, 1974, was the day burglars walked into an office in Los Angeles and took the 400 pages. 41 years later, to the day, the ship that secret was built around was delivered to be taken apart. She is gone. The submarine is not. Once it was public, A journalist named Harriet Ann Philippi asked for the agency's records about its own effort to keep the story out of the press. The reply did not say yes. It did not say no. It did not say the records were classified, which would have been an answer. It said the agency could neither confirm nor deny that any such records existed. Think about what that does. Refusing to release a document tells you the document is there. Refusing to say whether it is there tells you nothing and cannot be argued with because there is nothing to argue about. Philippi took it to court. Philippi against the Central Intelligence Agency, 1976. The maneuver survived, and it got a name. Glomar Response, named after this ship. 50 years later, it is standard language. When any government anywhere tells you it can neither confirm nor deny the existence of records, it is using a formula that exists because of a salvage operation in the Pacific in 1974. A refusal invented to protect one secret became permanent vocabulary. Which brings us to the page. In December 2007, the National Security Archive asked for the agency's own internal history of the operation. In February 2010, the agency released it. 50 pages from the autumn 1985 edition of its in-house journal, written by somebody who was there, whose name is still classified. And it is redacted. Here is what the released history of Project Azorian does not tell you. It does not tell you what it cost. It does not tell you what intelligence came out of the wreckage. And it does not tell you how much of the submarine they actually brought up. That is a history of an operation that does not say what the operation got. Now, earlier I said that almost every account gives you a number in feet and that we would come back to where it is from. It is from journalists, careful ones, working from sources, reconstructing what the government would not confirm. It is a good figure and it is probably right. But it is not in the official record. The one number every documentary repeats as the answer is the exact number the released history blacks out, and that is the shape of this whole thing. We know the ship, we know the claw, we know the day, the position, the failure, and the 6 men. We have the film of their funeral because the government released it. We do not know what they got. And we know precisely where that answer is being kept. There is a tomb in China that has been located, mapped, and deliberately left unopened because the people responsible decided the cost of opening it was too high. This is that same sentence in a different language, a record located, cataloged, and deliberately left sealed. The submarine is still down there. The page is still black. And both of those are decisions somebody made and can unmake. If you want the other film to watch after this one, make it The Tomb. Same question, same answer. Not yet.